Hi there, welcome to Transcendent Psych. In what follows, we have a really interesting interview with David Bentley Hart, who is a scholar and philosopher of religion, about his book, All Things Are Full of God, which is a far-ranging conversation we had today with the others I'll introduce you to in a second, about consciousness, mind, life, and the kind of top-down causality in a way that David sees reality as having, and better explaining life, language, meaning, consciousness, etc., than the common materialist orthodoxy that dominates our culture at this time. But enough about that content. You can discover it for yourself. One really interesting thing I've found about it, just to mention briefly, is his explanation of Aristotle's four causes and how this relates to consciousness, and how things are explained, I guess. But let me introduce you to my guests first of all. So I'm just going to read out their kind of bios, really. So we were joined by Orlindo Batista from Experiential Realism. He has his own YouTube, so definitely would check him out on there. And also by Heather Hamilton, who is an author. I'll read you her bio. She says, Heather Hamilton is an author and spiritual director living in Atlanta, Georgia. She released Returning to Eden in 2023, and you can see on this channel I interviewed her shortly after that on the book. And in her new book, Eat the Dirt, 52 poems on God and being human, will release in the autumn or fall, if you're American, 2025. And you can find her work at returningtoeden.com, but I'll put that info in the blurb for the YouTube video. Also, we were joined by Justin Coutts. Justin is primary author and founder of the New Eden Ministry. His writing and practice as a spiritual director are informed by his diverse background. Over the course of his life, he received spiritual formation in the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, Indigenous Ceremony, Ojibwe and others, and the United Church of Canada. He currently teaches Celtic Christianity with a particular emphasis on the monastic tradition and its applications for people today. As an Anamkara, which I think means soul friend in Celtic, he focuses primarily on religious formation, pastoral care, and theological exploration. And I'll put links for him also in the blurb. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to the interview. Enjoy. Okay, it's on. Okay, so today we're discussing a powerful book, All Things Are Full of Gods, by David Bentley Hart, philosopher and scholar of religion, prolific author, known to many viewers, I'm sure. And of course, we have the great privilege of David actually joining us to discuss it. And I've also got the privilege of being joined by some other gods of spiritual spaces on the internet, Orlindo Batista of Experiential Realism.
Experiential Realism.
Experiential
That's
Realism,
right.
No
problem.
Heather Hamilton, who's an author of Returning to Eden and some new books coming out this year. I'll put some info in the blurb underneath the YouTube. And Justin Coutts. Justin's like a spiritual director, similar to you, Heather, I think, in Canada, however. So welcome to everybody.
Hello. Thanks for having us, Rob.
Pleasure. Yeah. We got there in the end. So just to say as well, Heather and Justin done a marvelous job in stepping up just in this last week, because we had someone drop out, then we had someone else drop out who was replacing them. So thanks, guys, for doing that. So as a bit of an intro question, David, you've written, I think it's fair to say, in All Things Are Full of Gods, a comprehensive treatment of the contemporary debate about the nature of consciousness and whether it can be explained in, materialist, physicalist, naturalist, whichever word we want to use, terms. The book begins with the gods Psyche, Eros, Hermes, and Hephaestus in the intercosmia, the sort of space between Earth and the higher realms. And Psyche draws our attention to a rose, which is a nice touch, coming straight down to an earthly thing. Perhaps we can start there as our way in to the overall thesis of the book. What is Psyche? What are you wanting materialists to wake up to?
When we look at, I want to point out, by the way, that before I answer the question, endless prologue, the book isn't just about the structure of mind and mental acts, but also of life and of language, because they all, to my mind, are reducible to the same problem. And the rose is a good starting point for all of them, really, because when you attend to what consciousness does in its most ordinary employments, when you simply try to undertake a scrupulous phenomenological reflection on what's happening, you realize that there, within the very midst of quotidian experience, one encounters a mystery that, and it takes 500 pages for them to argue this out, is irreducible to a narrative of emergence from pre-conscious, pre-organic, pre-linguistic causes. Whether that understanding of emergence is strictly materialist, reductive, or some kind of physicalist, strong emergentism, which to my mind is like invoking magic. And the rose is to my mind the proper start. It's also, obviously, it has a certain eschatological significance as an image in Christian tradition, and Dante most obviously. But before we get to the rose of heaven, the rose in the garden already tells us that we're immersed in a reality that is not the accidental or epiphenomenal residue of something purely mechanical, purely material, purely consciousness. That from the very first, the mystery with which we're engaged is one that requires us to consider the priority of, I would say the divine, but of the realm of mind and of language and of life as governing laws from the start. If that makes anything clearer.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed because you set up things talking about the sort of the 4 Aristotelian causes as well, don't you? And but we can get into that, I guess.
Well, that too. Part of the problem with talking about Aristotelian causality is we're all inheritors of the 17th century myth of what the sciences accomplished when the new organon was adopted, and that required not only positing. It starts simply as a method of bracketing out any concerns other than bare metaphysical or physically syntactic relations. This just perfectly innocent gesture. Galileo lays it out as essentially a mathematical project, is what the physics is for him. But that just almost inevitably, not just by cultural happenstance, but according to the debate, but as a result of the debates of the time, metastasized rather quickly into an ontology and a metaphysics. And that involved re-mythologizing what Aristotelian causality was about. It becomes a defective attempt to get to a purely mechanical picture of nature, doing so naively, whereas in fact the argument of the book is this is a fundamental misunderstanding. First, that when Aristotle speaks of an atia or an ation, he uses both the feminine and the neuter forms. He's not talking about causality in that sense at all. He's talking about a system of predications that explains what something is, how it interacts with other things, and it's an entirely different set of issues. And yet, when you think about it, it raises questions, solvent questions about how we think about causality now, and whether, in fact, a reduction to mechanical causation as our methodological retreat can possibly account for realities that in the Aristotelian or the Neoplatonic adoption of the Aristotelian scheme requires a language of formal and final causality and a very different understanding of efficiency and material. So again, I'm not making things clearer, but
yeah, that's very helpful. Could you just for those listeners that might not know so much of their Aristotle, just give us a sort of quick rough outline of those four causes as you understand them?
Well, yeah, I must just when I used to lecture, I do this very crude thing of sketching it out on a board as sort of just a horizontal line intersected by a vertical line. The horizontal line is the relationship between a final cause and antecedent finality, that towards which the end towards which a thing is oriented, both intrinsically and extrinsically, both in itself and with regard to other things, which is also just a way of saying what the limits of its potentials are if it reaches the full extent of its potentials. And there's a relation between that and what is called in Aristotle the first principle of motion, archi tis kinesios, which we call efficient cause. Now, we think today that people use efficient cause to mean just sort of like one billiard ball hitting another, but that's not what Aristotle's talking about. He's talking about just the movement of becoming, which is irrepressible, but which occurs always toward an end. This is, I don't mean a designed end necessarily, just that it has an orientation towards a certain set of possible fulfillments of it. Well, that's the horizontal line. And the vertical for Aristotle is simply distinguishing between the occasion, the potential of something, what it is, what its formal determinations really are. And so form there is an atia as well, and matter, not necessarily in the sense we understand matter. It can just, as in later scholastic tradition, just be a realm of pure potency. It's not even a physical thing at all. And the intersection of these things gives you a full picture of what it is to say what something is, where it comes from, what it's made of, what its potentials are. And it's a system of recognizing and predicating things as the things they are, but in relationship to a wider reality. What happened in early modernity in pursuit of a method for examining physical processes without making any presuppositions is the final end of the horizontal line and the formal pinnacle of the vertical line are removed, and supposedly you just have efficiency and materiality. Even then, in doing that, you've completely changed the meaning of the terms because that's not what. Again, I always prefer to say Aristotelian etiology rather than causality, just to make some kind of distinction. Again, the issue is, though, was Aristotle proposing, or was Aristotelian tradition proposing some sort of basic physics that was then superseded by a more sophisticated physics? And the answer is no. He's giving you instead a way of a system of predication which presumes a certain ontology, but that has nothing to do with the mechanical model at all. So they weren't really surpassing Aristotelianism. They're simply talking about something completely different, and yet doing so in such a way that shows that the discourse upon which they lighted, for all its fruitfulness at the empirical level to a certain extent, nonetheless, as an explanatory model, still needs to be supplemented by something like an Aristotelian etiology, if it's to be explanatory rather than just predictive. Yeah, I don't think anything any clearer.
No, I was just going to say I've been a materialist for many years, and only recently did I become an idealist. But when I was a materialist, I remember reading a quote by Cicero, which made me think, and it's about the telos. And I think Cicero said something along the lines of, the telos is that which isn't a means to anything else, but to which all else is a means.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking deeply about that quote. It just made me think about intention, which seems to be missing in the materialist worldview.
Yeah.
And now hearing you talk about that, about Aristotle, it makes me think that he also made premature assumptions about reality, which were later disproved by Galileo, and I think it had something to do.
But that's a separate issue.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. Yeah,
he was a natural philosopher as well, and he did make suppositions that were surpassed. I mean, that's quite legitimate. He was also a scientist, but one has to segregate that question from the question of what he's doing with the etiological interrelations. And remember, they're relations of totally different modalities of one event. All you're doing is looking at an event and describing it from four necessary interrelated perspectives, but none of which is itself a physical cause in the sense that we think of physical causality, or have ceased thinking about physical causality in great realms of physics for the past 100 years now that the quantum era has hit its century mark. But yes, you're right. I mean, obviously, there are, and not just by Galileo, but by Newton and others. He drew conclusions, or rather made assumptions that were scientifically defective.
Yeah. I just wonder why the materialists or the physicalists of today take causality so seriously after being exposed to people like Jung, for example. He called causality into question. And but you still have some physicists like Max Tegmark that call time into question. They say maybe it's an illusion. Maybe if you step outside the 4D construct, if you go to the fifth dimension, say, you'll be able to see everything as a static object. And in order to experience time, you have to be inside, you have to be immersed in the 4D experience.
Well, space-time, I mean, that's what the Einsteinian revolution gives us, is not just space that is also, in which there is also extension of time, but what we have actually is space-time, as you say, a four-dimensional construct. Now, even if you allow for a qualification of that model by, say, quantum entanglement, right? Again, the arguments. Nonetheless, it remains the case that sure, you can assume a vantage subspecie aeternitatis, in which this is simply a totality. There, though, you're getting into a certain philosophical riptides and undercurrents, because what scientists, even like Max Tegmark, who's very sophisticated, tend to do is they make a sort of univocal equation between what we're talking about in the causal structure of space-time, and whether from a vantage outside of time, you treat this as an accomplished totality. And so they're thinking in 5 dimensions. They're not thinking sort of, the analogy between time and eternity that the ancient model presumed, and eternity in 2 senses, the sort of heavenly eon, which would be sort of like the realm of space-time seen subspecie aeternitatis. But then that realm itself, in order to be ontologically coherent, that is, to have an intentional structure that's also perfectly unified, would have to be dependent on a yet more eminent eternity, that of the divine. And that's where, of course, the temper of our age is, well, that's just pure metaphysics or just pure religion. But it's not. It's a real logical aporia. I don't know if I'm touching on the same things, but I've often claimed that Neoplatonism, say of the kind you get in Plotinus, is just common sense philosophy. If that's all, it's not metaphysical speculation as such. There's plenty of metaphysical speculation, but if you think about it, let's not talk about space and time. Let's talk about your space and your time. If you do something intentionally, and everything you do is intentional, even, I mean, not in necessarily the voluntative sense, but in the structure of mind, everything you do has to have an intentional horizon for you even to be conscious of something. You have to grasp it with your mind. If you are in time, or as Plotinus would have said, or even Plato, if you're in chronos, okay, that's a temporal succession that is never complete in itself. So you here and the end you want to reach are separated from one another temporally. But nonetheless, as an intentional agent, you already possess that end. It's already part of the structure of your act. So it already has an ontology. And so what Plotinus or just about any ancient philosopher will do is say, well, then there must be a noetic order in some sense, a realm of nous or a realm of the eon, in which, at the ideal level, the act is always already complete in itself. It's a totality. There can never be chronos without the eon. That's what what Plato actually said was not time as the moving image of eternity, but the chronos, sublunary time, is the image of the eon, complete in itself. But then the next thing is, well, but this is still at the noetic level, it constitutes a profound unity, even though it can be differentiated formally and really. So there must yet be an even more radical ontological principle of pure unity as such, and that becomes the realm of the one, which is beyond the ages. Υπρας aeonos, so I don't know if I don't know how obscure I'm being, because I haven't finished all my coffee this morning.
Can I ask a question? As you started to touch on the word unity, Rob, can you hold up the cover of the book again? I believe you
sure.
had it there right with you. David, pull it back. Something that struck me about this book when I first saw it that felt different to me than your other books was the cover. The essence, like the cover had an essential quality to it that almost told me something about the book and what you were getting at in terms of, are all things full of gods, the divinity that is infusing everything. It's like the cover itself, to go back to how we were talking about the rose, starting with the rose, I'm reminded of, the quote unquote greatest sermon that the Buddha ever preached was just setting a rose in front of his audience. And
a lotus, but yeah.
A lotus, thank you. The flower. And that's what the cover did for me. And so even, as we're going through all the intellectual arguments to make, there's an essential quality about the cover and the beauty of it that's actually informing what I think that you're trying to say. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Curiously, I can. I'm glad you noticed that the cover, the book is visually different from my previous Yale publications. And thank God, because I was really getting tired of a white cover with blue lettering, as being the Hart style. It's not one I chose, but by the way, you remember the rest of the story of the flower sermon, right?
I believe that there was the one person
Bodhidharma, who smiled. Okay, and he understood. None of the other arhats understood, and so it's Bodhidharma who, having understood, is then sent to the east, and that's the migration of Buddhism into East Asia, and which leads to the title of one of my favorite films. Why is Bodhidharma going to the east? But I'm glad it's not that I insisted on a particular cover art. That's the cover I chose when presented with the possibilities. But it is true that I didn't want a blank white space, just because the entire point of the book is that all experience, all consciousness is already always informed by a rich semantics. of experience, a sensuous semantics, an intentional semantics, meaningfulness as such, which, if you know my pathetic tendencies, I tend to equate ultimately with the value of beauty as the transcendental horizon of the transcendentals themselves, the desirable in and of itself. And so I would have been disheartened if the book physically did not communicate some of that concern that the gods, okay, I want to point out that word's being used equivocally. I'm not recommending a return to polytheism as a working, although I wouldn't object to it either if it were an intelligent one, but you know what I mean. But the gods are really there. They really appear in every instant, in the rose, in the butterfly, in the sort of tenderness of that's from, you know, the picture there of Eros and Psyche embracing. So yes, you noticed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the quality of the cover, and I mean, I think herein lies the essential problem: is materialism requires us to assign meaning externally to the phenomena that we see, whereas in the example of the rose or the cover, it is truly full of something that is emanating meaning, that's emerging out of it, and that brings me into the correct orientation.
It's also something for which we have a capacity, and yet it's a capacity that doesn't simply grasp or comprehend. It's a capacity always to be surprised anew. And this is an essential point, because that radiance, you know, the radiance of being in its own splendor, you know, the radiance of the good, the true, the beautiful, the one, being itself, is not empirical data that is then converted it by a system, an organic system that then latterly, as a kind of epiphenomenal fiction, mistakes this for intentionality and meaning, or lays that over it like the realm of qualia is actually illusory. It's the realm of Maya, whereas the only really real is the mathematical relation. Instead, from the first, that intentionality towards semantic meaning and fullness and ever more fullness and a sort of creative summoning to an ever deeper engagement is intrinsic in us. And when you realize that intrinsic presence manifests itself in the barest acts of cognition from the first, that there is never any moment that is free, that is prior to that, either phylogenetically or ontogenically, either in terms of evolution or in terms of personal development as an individual, that you realize that the materialist reduction has a twofold problem. Not only the ontological issue of, you know, the world that shows itself being without why, not without a material causal history, but without a why, as Angelus Silesius would say, but that what consciousness is doing, what life is doing, what language is doing, is from the first, has an intentional horizon that's beyond the physical, and yet filled in by actual phenomenal experience evermore. And I really honestly don't believe you can ever get back to a plausible physicalist narrative of what's going on in that union between being and consciousness.
Yeah, I was going to say, you mentioned Neoplatonism, and there is a sense in which in the one, all paradoxes are reconciled. It's complete, and then it somehow trickles down into our world, the world of senses, you know, the physical reality that we're immersed in. And sometimes I listen to idealists like Bernardo Kastrup talk about mathematics as though it's a mental construct.
We got jazz hands going on.
I mean, I'm sure he's well-meaning, but his philosophical training is a little needs a bit of work here and there. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, because
I wouldn't call his idealism entirely worked out, but yes, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do rate him, but at the same time, I'm a bit lost when he says that mathematics is a product of human mentation, and it says nothing about the fundamentality of objective reality. And to me, that denies Platonism, and completely dismisses.
Platonism is profoundly Pythagorean. That's its mystical as well as its philosophical foundation.
Right. Well, it brings in intuitionistic logic, or intuitionism, instead of classical logic. So he says intuitionistic logic is what he favors, because he reckons mathematics is a product of metacognitive human minds, and he reckons mind at large isn't metacognitive, and it discovers things through us. And to me, I think it's backwards. I think it's the other way around. I think we're the ones who get insights into a mind that, as human beings, we can't possibly comprehend at the moment. It's almost like he makes us gods in a different way, you know.
And I'm afraid that it sort of inadvertently falls back on a representationalism rather than an actual idealism. And it's not surprising that he confuses Schopenhauer with idealists. He wrote a book on Schopenhauer, which is a very bad book on Schopenhauer. I'm sorry. And
I haven't read it.
But he doesn't. If you can confuse Schopenhauer with the idealist claims, then you've inverted your understanding, and you're back to sort of just in the Kantian project, just short of the opus posthumum. You're still in the realm of a kind of hard and fast representationalism that can become a kind of egoistic idealism, but that isn't really ontologically robust enough. And no, I mean, mathematics. It's funny thing is, I've known lots of mathematicians over the years. One of my dearest and oldest friends, a mathematician of extraordinarily high caliber. Among them, I've met maybe one that I would characterize as an atheist in a meaningful sense. There are others who think they're atheists, but nonetheless, as mathematicians, their experience, and experience is important here, is that they are in touch with an eternal order of values. So, how often is it the case? Remember, if mathematics were purely a human construction that's posterior to mind in its fundamental agency, then really it should follow the lines of empirical experience. But that's never been true. I mean, especially once you get, even in the realm of geometry, the original high math of ancient Greek culture, you're already in a realm of ideal forms that don't have any immediate physical instantiation. But in higher mathematics today, it's a language, and it's a language that often only after it's already been developed is it found to have applications to the physical sciences, by clarifying problems that physical models alone, based on what a purely inductive process could never arrive at. And so I think that puts mathematics, like language, in fact, that's what it is, it's a form of language, in a realm that has to have an eternal veil. It has to be the very ground of the structure of consciousness.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if Kastrup is being cautious by using inductive reasoning because he wants to be accepted by, he doesn't want to seem to woo in his mind, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have nothing against him. I think he's philosophically unrefined at times, with good philosophical intuitions at others. I think it's better to read people like Stephen R.L. Clarke or Lloyd Garrison, or people who really are much better trained in what's going on, or really fine specialists in German idealism, like my friend here, Vittorio Husta, and others. with Kastrup, you're still at the sort of popular level of discourse where a very clever man, a little too sure of himself perhaps, is saying some things that are right. He's intuiting. It's sort of like the way the Beatles could come up with sophisticated chord progressions even though they had no formal musical training. Sometimes inspiration strikes, and although that's an extravagant example because in their case it was weirdly brilliant. But I mean, so someone lesser, So I don't know. I don't know what he's trying to accomplish.
He's good for showing how untenable materialism is.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And he's quite humble in his assertions, and he does say, to be fair to him, he does say that by no means is his analytic idealism the final word,
right.
But he likes to think that he's less wrong in how he used to think before in his days when he was a materialist. And
he's definitely correct about that.
Yeah.
I was going to ask actually, David, on that note, maybe we can come back in a minute to kind of maybe give you a chance to outline what you think the major moves are for materialists and why they don't work. But perhaps just while we're on the sort of Kastrup theme, a lot of viewers will be persuaded of a mind-first ontology, but like Kastrup, Philip Goff and others will kind of say that they're still happy to remain within a sort of naturalist camp. And I kind of suspect that you think that doesn't work. Would you like to expand on that?
At that point, it becomes practically meaningless. Well, I mean, I can approach the question in two ways. I can lay out the history of this swerve, so to speak, or describe its logic. So let me start with logic, and maybe we'll get back to the history. The moment you posit a fundamental intentionality in nature, you've already exceeded nature in this sense. And it's why, I'll just say this in parentheses, why the notion that intentionality is emergent from non-intentional causes is a meaningless claim. I mean, Daniel Dennett, one way of describing his philosophical career is that he spent half a century trying to make plausible that transition from the non-intentional to the intentional, and very honorably failing to do so. In fact, making his case worse and worse the more he pursued defending it. And what that says, in the book, I talk about syntax and semantics, not just because language is one of the topics of the book, but because this is an accepted shorthand within the physical sciences too, and within science, in philosophy of mind as well. And you mentioned Galileo earlier. Well, there's a good example of the inductive project at its most beautifully, austerely pure, most chaste. And it's a good thing. I mean, Galileo, people tend to forget because of his little contretemps with the Pope, was a very devout Catholic till the end of his life. He was not. But what he believed was what the next step, what made natural philosophy and physics an actual science, was prescinding from the level of the qualitative experience, which we naturally put in Aristotelian terms. I mean, whether we want to, we're always asking, what is this for? Why is this, what does this mean? Well, he's just stepping back from those questions altogether, not saying that they're wrong questions, but that they're a different set of questions. What's real for physics is a realm of mathematical absolute values, mass, velocity. That leaves out color, that leaves out flavor, that leaves out consecutive reasoning, that leaves out all sorts of things. But what it does leave you is a realm that you can model mathematically and make incredible advances. But this quickly becomes an ontology. So I guess we're talking about the history as well here. It quickly becomes an ontology because, of course, the sciences, once they've got their model, don't want artificially to limit the realm of their inquiries. And so it becomes a sort of omnivorous picture of how you should understand everything. Now, this is a problem, say, for consciousness or even for life, because in order to get to that model, that mechanical model or Galileo's mathematical model, you've had to remove everything that's characteristic of consciousness and life to get back to the bare relations of physical quantities, right? And so then trying to use that model to explain the things you've excluded in order to create that model is a methodological paradox before anything else, right? So the question is, can you say, then move from this bare syntax? I wouldn't even call it a syntax. I think that's a misuse of the term syntax, as I explain in the book. The syntax and semantics and reality are inseparable. Syntax. So let's call it parataxis, just, one damn thing after another. One billiard ball hitting another, one temperature gradient giving rise to this or that sort of useful action, one kind of entropy. Okay. Can you get from that to the intentional structure that more and more the sciences are acknowledging is intrinsic to the systems of life? That the sort of like the purely genetocentric picture that kind of tries to make organic life something like a species of crystalline morphogenesis or something like that, just one physical, is repeatedly failing. And we've known that since the 1930s when Barbara McClintock, who discovered the way in which cells engineer their own restructuring, just by experiments on mice. She didn't get the Nobel Prize till the 80s, though. It took people so long to accept what she had found. She claims it's not because she was a woman, but I'm not so sure. I'm not sure, we know that there's a structure of intentionality. No, we already know it's in language, and we should know it's in thought. I mean, in the Anglophone philosophy, we try to break mind down into these separate mechanical functions so that consciousness can be separated from intentionality. But as I argue in the book, and I wouldn't have time to do here, these are all artificial separations. Phenomenology of conscious acts shows that you just can't make this. So intentionality is part of the structure of reality. At that moment, you have already, at the physical level, exceeded what physics allows, because the future is a kind of causality. It's not a mechanical causality, but already it's not an emergent, meaning intention, it's not an emergent reality. But beyond that, intentionality is self-referential. It's an infinite regress to try to get past intentionality or before intentionality, because any real intentional structure has two horizons. There's the thing in the middle distance, the thing that's immediately available to cognition and desire, that is the object of your intention. But there's always a why. There's always a cui bono, because you can't intend something without having a reason for intending it. It may not be one that you can conceptualize, but it might just, but even if it's just animal hunger, you have to recognize it as food. You have to recognize it as desirable. You have to recognize the organic, not consciously, but there's a desire to persist and all that, which means that in every act of intentionality, easier to demonstrate when you're talking about language or other things, but nonetheless true even at the level of physical systems, there's a transcendental level of intentionality that is the cui bono of the act. And this is why in the book I a few times refer again and again to the brilliant, very brilliant French philosopher Reknowned, who started as an arch-physicalist like our friend Arlindo here, who found himself unable to make sense of what he called the realm of values, which is prior to the intentional structure of life and intrinsic to it. You can't intend something without already having intended something. There's no way intention just spontaneously emerges from the non-intentional. In fact, it wouldn't be intentional then. This seems like a simple thing, but it's very hard for people to grasp it. I've had even trained philosophers who had to really sit back and think, oh yeah, especially if they're trained in the analytic tradition, which just tends to treat the philosophy of previous ages as if it was all prologue and mistaken. And so they never, You don't really look at what the classical or the continental traditions are grappling with. I mean, they read Husserl and they don't see how incredibly rigorous he is, because he's not writing it in formal logical notation. He's Husserl, he's not Frege. You know? When you see that, you know, when you grasp this intentional structure, the whole, I would assert, the whole of physicalism collapses. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be a Berkeleyan style of idealist or a Malebranchian, and you just have this sort of occasionalist ontology where the realm of phenomena maps onto a prior real causality. You can have a real integrity of its own, a real physical integrity. That's the beauty of the Aristotelian system. It's at once, it applies to any phenomenon, physical or otherwise. But the integrity of the system itself cannot be founded on itself. The physical integrity, the integrity that the physical order requires, is an ideal integrity.
Yeah, it always amazes me at how my dog tries to communicate with me. You know, when he wants to sit on my lap, he will actually pat me on the shoulder with his paw, and you know, it's a being that lacks human language, but he has an intention. You know, and
speak for your dog.
Yeah, you know, you can clearly see there's a mind there, you know, when I look at him, and this is what baffled me in my materialism. How does it seem like he has intention, and yet they're telling me that it's just mechanisms behind it? You know, like there's no intention, there's no intrinsic intention from the get-go. It just didn't make sense to me. Deep down, I struggled with it. I struggled with the whole concept of consciousness as emergent, and you know, and the same with babies. It's, you know, they lack language, but if they're hungry, they cry, they scream. You know, they make it known that they want something. There's an intention, there's a will behind it, and I think that gets lost in physicalism.
And to acquire language, and I'm very weird in not limiting language to the human realm. I mean, I do believe that animals do have linguistic practices and functions. Simply, you know, obviously, most dogs couldn't write the phenomenology of spirit. Mine could have, but he was exceptional. But you know, it's clearly the case that it makes no sense to say that this is just, well, instinct, which is a null word. It means nothing. It's just a way of getting around the question. Or to say this is purely a set of physical reactions in a system of data processing. No, it's not. It's not react. You can't react without intentionality. You can't even be conscious of reacting, of having something to react without a prior intentionality. You can never get away from intentionality, even at the level of the cells of your body. And yet, you cannot fit intentionality into the materialist narrative tout court. It always exceeds it. And in fact, it's that excess of the physical that is intentionality.
To bring in a quick metaphor.
Wait, Justin there raised his hand. He has prior.
Well,
And he's a Canadian, and I just get a strange thrill from hearing him pronounce his O's.
well, I'll tell you right now that my Hus is very very.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, I'll tell you all about it. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to reflect on the question of language being inherent in all things, and also the notion of mind being inherent in all things, and that being one. But I wanted to talk about it from just very briefly, my background. From the time I was a kid, I spent a lot of time in Indigenous ceremony. And so my primary spiritual formation was as a Skabewish to an Anishinaabe elder who, Anishinaabe is a language. But that's what, I didn't know the word animist until later.
But where was this? Sorry, forgive me. I don't want to go from.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah, I live in Northern Ontario right now, so I've been to ceremony all over, but primarily...
What nation are we talking?
Oh, an Anishinaabe, mostly. Although I have a fair bit of experience with Dakota as well.
Okay. Well, you may not. This is curious. When I was an undergraduate, I almost went into Native American. But why? But being I'm mostly working with Tsitsa, Cheyenne, But of course, why would I take a job from an actual name? I say it made no sense. So, anyway, go on. Yes, I'm sorry I interrupted. You just happened to mention one of my favorite topics.
No, that's fine. One of my favorite topics, and I love to chat. I think chatting is one of the best ways to learn. And so what I was taught, I mean, I didn't know the word animist until I started to study philosophy later, much later. But the word animist describes pretty accurately what I was taught in ceremony, and that is that everything is alive. But not only, I'll go back to the rose because it's such a beautiful image. You know, I'm familiar somewhat, not as much as the rest of you probably, with the Neoplatonic ideas of beauty. You know, so there's a it's drawing us into it, the rose, and it's calling to us. But at the same time, in the Ojibwe tradition, they would say not only is there a sort of subconscious gravitational pull towards something that it's communicating, but it actually speaks with a voice, and not just you know, a sort of abstract nous mind, but like a mind like I have that has desires and intentions and words that it can communicate. And I'm curious if you feel that a rose could speak, not just speak to me in a metaphorical sense, but speak to me, perhaps without words, perhaps using some other spiritual form of language. But yeah, I'm curious what you think of that.
Yeah. Die Rose ist ohne Warum. I would say not only that it can speak, but that it is speech. You know, that it is language all the way down. That's another way of trying to reconfigure the way you talk about Aristotelian etiology to help people understand it, is to think of reality as the structure of an intelligible communication, or of a sentence. You know, the universe is one very large sentence. But yes, no, I to me, it's not just the pathetic fallacy, you know, that I want to imagine that there's a rose sprite or rose fairy there who's, although I do, and I'm not imagining it actually. I've had very good conversations with elves and fairies and the like. Not when I'm entirely sober necessarily, but you know. But no, I think the rose. Yes, I mean literally, there's a communicative structure there. You know, it's brilliant. Of course, Schelling is brilliant on this. Also, Sergei Bulgakov, one of the greatest theological mind of the 20th century. I brook no debate on that. Is about, and of course, he's rewriting Fichte in a more Trinitarian way. He's taking Fichte back, you know, making it more Trinitarian. But not going the route of Hegel, in which Trinitarianism is asserted in a different and arguably more frightening way, in which everything is an articulate. It's the unspoken, or if you're using patristic language, the paternal depth, you know, the father, the unspoken, the manifest logos, and then the realm of spiritual, well, I don't want to say synthesis, but spiritual communion, where your spirit and the spirit of the rose are one spirit, the divine spirit that's breathed into Adam, you know, the neshama, Yahweh, the Penoe, Tukiryu in the beginning. And so I don't use, I wouldn't, it's far more than a metaphorical claim. I would say the rose is language. The rose does speak. In fact, Maximus the Confessor says the same thing. You don't have to get as late as Bulgakov or Schelling. I mean, Maximus is wonderful about how everything is a logos within the logos, and he uses that in every sense, as meaning metaphysical structure, ideal structure, but also word within the word. You know.
Yeah, that's
the
great.
burning bush, perhaps.
Every bush is the burning bush if you see it correctly. Christ is always on the Mount of Transfiguration. So is everyone else if you see them correctly.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of
Maya. Let's go Vedantic here. You know.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Eriugena, who of course draws from Maximus. I'm just a lay reader. I just picked up Herphysian in translation and started trying to figure it out.
It's wonderful, isn't it? No?
It's changed my mind, quite literally, reshaped it. And so what you were just saying there brought me to my second question. Is it now a good time, Rob, for my other question that I threw by you, or do you want me to wait for a better time for that question?
the microcosm, macrocosm. I wonder. I was got a related question. Maybe we can merge them somehow. But because I was going to ask David, maybe we can do this in one. I'm just conscious of time. In terms of like, so we've got this sort of I don't know, fullness, pleroma of being, the Brahman, divine, the ultimate layer, in which everything else is.
Well, rather than formless, let's say superformal.
Okay.
Or supraformal, even, or the form of all forms, the nature of all natures. Yeah.
So we've got that maybe at the top of our hierarchy, if we want to represent it that way. I think we're all possibly all monists in the group. I certainly am.
Does everyone know the secret handshake? What's the password? The password is swordfish. Yes, then you
I was just thinking, like, a thing I'm constantly puzzled about, and this would work as a problem whether you were a materialist in a way as well, because they're often monists and coming from a different point of view, is how do we explain the multiplicity of reality? So if you've got an aboriginal oneness, how do we end up with variegation, diversity, evolution? And if you're really on it, David, maybe we can link that into Justin's question about macrocosm, microcosm. I don't know. So above, so below. Yeah.
Ooh, there's a dog in the background. Are you going to? Do you want to add to that question now, or should I answer that and then move to?
Should we do it in two parts? Should we just how do we go from the one to the many, maybe, and then
at that point, this is a book that we're talking about is a book of philosophy, not theology. Not that I strictly separate the two. I don't believe that's possible. I believe even A.J. Ayer was doing theology in a sense at times, but there are different answers to that. Obviously, within the post-Nicene Christian tradition, there's and this is the thing that Schelling and then Hegel after him pick up very late in the day, but that Origenes and Maximus, Eriugena, if you prefer, which is probably more correct, or Maximus before them, or even Gregory of Nyssa, understood, is that once you've asserted this sort of co-equality of the Trinitarian persons, you're making a statement about the constitutes, is that it is always the case that the hidden is also the manifest. Otherwise, there's no there's no act of being, and God is infinite being. So the Father is always already known to God's self in the Logos, and this knowledge and love is made replete and dynamic and creative in the one spirit, and that community. But that, of course, you're borrowing there also, in a sense, a Neoplatonic hierarchy in which there's a sort of necessary benevolence, a sort of necessary overflow of the good, and the nous is sort of the prism of the undifferentiated light of the one. But the Christian claim, what became, you find in Augustine and in the Cappadocians, again, especially Maximus and the Pseudo-Dionysius, and then wonderful Nicholas of Cusa is maybe the greatest thinker of this in early modernity or late medieval. So, that there's always already within the very, I don't want to use the term constitution, but we don't have the language, constitution of God as God, already the reflective otherness as part of that one agency. Now, that's the Christian answer. Within Vedanta, for instance, the problem becomes a lot more difficult, especially with it's somewhat mediated in, say, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. Ramanujan has a sort of Bhaktic core in which the terms Brahman Nirguna and Brahman Saguna, Brahman without attributes, Brahman with attributes. In Shankara, in Advaita Vedanta, it's very hard actually to understand why, especially if you think you're ranking God without attributes, Brahman Nirguna above Saguna, why there is this emanation or degringolade, because it in that tradition, Maya which really just means the power of creation, does take on an opprobrious connotation as being almost convertible with sin. So the creation and nescience, or creation and ignorance. So I would say the Trinitarian answer is the one that appeals to me, whether one's dogmatically Christian or not. And, I think the German idealists did get this right. They understood the significance of this doctrine, how it answers certain ontological aporias in the prior physics. And I've written on that before. I have a book called The Hidden and the Manifest that has 2 essays on just this issue. But I mean, there are 2 different things to keep in mind. Whether from the vantage of the finite and the plural and the successive, we are obliged by reason and experience to work our way back to something prior to that is not finitude and differentiation and succession in the way we understand them. And I'd say the answer is yes. The second question is then, can we put ourselves in the place of that one and say, why from there do we get to here? And there, until we know as we are known and no longer see in a glass darkly, no, I think for that there has to be an immediate intuition, immediate spiritual intuition of the truth. For Maximus, you go past episteme and then rush into the embrace of the Godhead in pure gnosis, which is neither conceptual nor non-conceptual. But it's beyond finite concepts, and that's the true knowing. That's what Paul is talking about, going from glory to glory. So at the philosophical level, one has to keep one's eyes on the former issue. Do we have an answer for the finite that is not this return to the priority of mind? And I say no. Do we understand why being is differentiated as we know? We can make statements about the bonum diffusivum sui, love as an ontological principle that shares itself, not just as an effective state, whatever. But then we're in the realms of faith and metaphysics and groping in the dark. Before we get to that, where we can be very clear and precise is recognizing the insufficiency of the materialist answer.
Yeah.
I do like the Adi Shankara clay pot analogy, where mind is clay and the ceramics are the transient objects, and the objects are just illusions. They don't last, and there is only really clay. There was only ever mind. So it's quite powerful. And why do we create
it's formal causality? But you notice it doesn't pretend that the clay isn't clay. It just makes the clay itself dependent and contingent upon an ideal structure.
Right.
It's not a crude Cartesianism in which mind is disembodied res cogitans and matter is mechanical res extensa, but rather understands that you have to collapse these categories into an understanding of the rational act, or rational not in the reductive sense, you know what I mean, spiritual act of agency.
Right.
Spiritual agency, active agency is a pleonasm. Excuse me. Pleonasms are bad.
Yeah.
Thanks
So
very much.
Justin, what was your supplement?
Yeah, so I have a question that's
about it, yes.
What's that say?
You have a question about this, right?
I have a question about this. Yeah, sorry. I'll remember to play it my Canadian accent for you.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to offend you. Sorry.
That doesn't offend me at all.
I'm real sorry. I
believe in the music of all peoples, even Canadians. In fact, right now, I wish I were.
Yeah, well, we're real appreciative of that. That Americans are so generous to us. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. We're so generous that we may be invading next month, for all I can tell.
There you go. Well, now that I've finished talking like a fool, I'll talk like a fool with fancy words. My question is my own growing edge of theology. I have to admit, I was asked to come here last minute, and I have not read your book, so I understand some of the general premises of it, and we've been talking. I know you have
ignorance is what it is.
Yeah. Well, ignorance is one of my specialties, and I know you have a leveled ontology in the book to understand, if I understand correctly, both And I'm hoping you can comment on the relationship between the micro and the macrocosm, going back sort of to Maximus and Eriugena. The leveled ontology that we find in the world, does it match, and is it the same then therefore as the leveled ontology of the human soul as an individual manifestation of the larger macrocosm?
Yeah, nothing can exist outside this ontology, because this ontology is just a description of what it is to exist in itself, something in itself, and in relation to everything else.
Yeah. Okay. So we're on the same page then. And then my real question in the heart of it is about the participatory nature between the macro and the microcosm, and how and to what extent through spiritual practice we are able to participate in angelic realms. If I'm going to use the Dionysian language, I like the celestial hierarchy. That's how I understand heaven myself. And I feels like there's some kind of correlation between the fact that our interior hierarchy, our own interior celestial hierarchy of all the angels which are within us, presumably then the one being the nous, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. I'm hoping you can clarify some of these things.
Well, the nous, well, of course, in Plotinus, it has both a fallen and an unfallen aspect, but the nous within us is our connection to the one in its own.
Right.
Simply, yeah, okay.
Okay, good. So I've got that right. And then it feels like the similarities between them is almost what makes it possible for us to understand the world. Like the intelligibility of the cosmos is dependent upon the fact that our consciousness is a mirror image of the cosmos, and therefore we're actually like recollecting in that Platonic sense, like remembering what we're made of, so to speak, and that's what it is to learn about the world. Is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you've already more or less stated my position.
Awesome.
See if there's anything I need to add to that. Well, structure of participation, one of the curious questions of philosophy of mind, which also becomes a question in the sciences, is the fittedness of consciousness to being. How does this happen? Now, as I said, the mechanical philosophy began not just with Galileo, but with Bacon and others, by stating that the realm we're going to investigate, which later on becomes the realm of the really real in cultural consciousness, but at first it's just the realm we're going to investigate is one that is dissembled, from which, in a sense, we're always separated. There's a Cartesian gulf here already, because we apprehend it in terms of qualia, fragrance, taste, visual impressions, auditions, but that this isn't real. These semantics are laid over the Ding an sich, or being, there's a Kantian aspect. So you have a representationalist schism between the world we know is the world that dwells within us, within our cognitions, and within the apparatus of perception, of which the real world is an occasion, but which does not immediately bring us into communion with being, but merely represents it to us under the form of posterior impressions that we fabricate. So we have a certain power over reality. So, there's a critique of pure reason. The realm, in a sense, getting past your dogmatic slumber and then getting past Hume, who woke you from your dogmatic slumber, you can retreat to the certitudes of consciousness by separating what's going on from the world out there formally, and recognizing that just in some mysterious way the latter is the occasion of the former, but we're trapped within the confines of the former, so we can never really get to the latter, though we can come up with mathematical figurations. I think this is fundamentally false, and it starts from the presupposition that syntax, or as I prefer to call it, that paratactic picture of nature, is reality as such, rather than an abstracted and distilled calculus for understanding certain physical processes. And what I would say is, the reality of the rose is the rose, the color, the scent, and all that. Now, it may differ from perceptual apparatus to perceptual apparatus, but at the end of the day, the form of the rose, the form of redness, now we don't have to think of this in terms of static absolutes, but in terms of the formal structure, is what reality is. And the mind has an aptitude, and there's a real communication between mind and being, which I just clearly there is. We can pretend that we can make sense of this as pure representationalism, but that's not our experience, and that's not what we presume when we're actually, say, doing science or cooking dinner or walking the dog. That aptitude is real because at the formal level, our understandings, reality, the forms that inform mind and the forms that inform the world are one and the same form, and world and soul encounter one another in a profound spiritual unity at the formal level. Now, again, I'm using almost mystical language here, and in the book, I try instead to put this in a slightly drier, or that there simply is an indistinction between the formality of nature, which we know is real because we see the intentionality working in nature, and the formality of consciousness and its intentionality. And however you understand that, it means the structures of consciousness and of life and of language are there at the very beginning, even if as yet no one is speaking French, at the time of the Big Bang. Maybe Hebrew existed, but no other language,
Well, obviously Hebrew did, yeah. Well, that and Sanskrit, I assume.
Yeah.
Aristotle, if I can talk for a little longer, I hope I'm not hogging the mic, but Aristotle and Paraphysian, and you say his name better than I do. I just read things and don't have any.
No, you're probably right. No one actually, Aristotle literally means born in Ireland.
Yeah, his name's redundant. John Scotus Aristotle means John the Scotsman.
John the Irish.
John the Irishman from Ireland, yeah.
It sounds like an Irishman in Boston who's very proud of his I'm an Irishman.
Yeah. Well, I think he came up with the name because he just signed one of his documents, Aristotle, and I think he's such a clever guy that he wanted to mix Greek, Latin, and Irish together because those were his languages of learning. And he came up with a name that was short and succinct and blended all of them together. But anyway, he has this idea, which I think is Aristotelian. I haven't read Aristotle or Plato or anything. But he talks about the way that we are created within each other and that the way that the angels are created within us when we learn things. So whenever we learn something, Aristotle says that we are participating in the angelic realms of the gods of that knowledge, I guess we could say, the angels of that knowledge. And
angels of our better natures. Our better angels.
What's that, sorry?
The better angels of our natures, yes.
Yeah. And that they are then created in us. And the way I think of it is patterns. He doesn't quite say that, but that there's a pattern to the knowledge that exists in the world around us. And that pattern becomes created within us when we learn something. And that's participation in that angelic realm. And he says that the same thing happens between people, so that right now, as you and I are speaking, I am being created within you, and you are being created within me, so that the patterns of our souls merge. I don't know how to think of it, because they don't become one. It's not like you and I become the same person, but at the same time,
but we don't become
part of who we are. You become part of who I am.
We don't become the same psychological subject. We don't become the same empirical self. If I want to get Kantian about it, we do experience, what he would call transcendental self, or the apperceptive self in its unity. That is, that it doesn't differ from you to me. Now, we differ from one another, but we also participate in this prior unity, and as such, are able to be formal and material causes to one another. I form you, you form me. Agency and patiency, because we're finite beings in these things. The reason this is possible is also, but it's also the reason why fire can heat water, is because of that prior unity and it allows for, and it requires, in fact, a sort of radical notion of coherence. We are already thoroughly involved in one another, even if we haven't met. It's not just that. I mean, in some sense, this is already true, say, of me and the victims of some horrible catastrophe, or the victims of war, the starving children in Gaza and all. It's both a tragic and a beautiful truth that because of this, and you can, it is Aristotelian, but remember, whenever you're talking about Neoplatonism, Aristotle's been fully absorbed into it, so it's always legitimate. You can always invoke Aristotle.
David, sorry. I was going to ask, does that connect into, I know it's not exactly the same idea, but thinking like Carl Jung's, the collective unconscious, if we were to think of, there's a sort of surface physical level, and we go down, maybe then we've got the different levels of consciousness, and then we've got the one at the bottom. Is there any kind of value in putting these taxonomies, if you like, or hierarchies?
I mean, I'm not a Jungian, but I do think this is true, that and I'm perfectly happy to say, it manifests itself in different cultural forms that are analogous to one another. I mean, myths that repeat themselves across cultures that haven't been in contact, or developments in thought, philosophy, logic, the arts. I think there's some real value. What I hesitate to do is to turn it into a sort of hermetism, in which you have the key to the understanding of these symbolic forms, and you end up writing books like Valentin Tomberg's, in which you're pronouncing but if one isn't dogmatical about it, or attempts to turn it into a kind of secret esoteric knowledge, but just recognizes this is true, that we participate at large in one and the same structure of communicability and meaning, and the relationship between the contingent and the absolute, the created and the divine, and all that. Yes. I mean, and some of it's obvious. I mean, a father figure, a mother figure, and all that. But other things, stories that have about gods and mortals recurring, for instance, I think is a good example of a reality that isn't just a coincidence because we have the same basic bodily structure. That something more is going on, and at the level of consciousness, not just at the level of historical or material conditions.
Ever since I've become an idealist, my life has become more meaningful. And hearing Justin mention angels, I sometimes get number syncs, which makes sense to me because I've read about those numbers. And then at the same time, sometimes it feels like the universe speaks to me. Whenever I have some kind of question, or whenever I'm, I want to know about a particular subject, all of a sudden something on the telly comes up which informs me about that subject. And it's quite striking. So do you have anything to say about the idea of synchronicity, which
yeah, that's funny. I mean, we're getting really Jungian here, aren't we?
Yeah, I was going to say, are you sure you're not a Jungian?
Except it is strange, isn't it? Because we've all had the experience, and I think most of us have had it often enough and in a curious enough way that it does exceed probability, right? I mean, it's like suddenly thinking of someone that you haven't talked to for 20 years, and 5 minutes later getting a phone call, which has happened to me, or this pretty well established phenomenon of an artist who's about to die, but you don't know he or she is dying. There's suddenly an uptick in an interest. It's like there was before Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau died, there was this rise suddenly in people buying recordings. And I myself got this real craze. I'm a big music collection, which I just gave to my nephew. I hope he's grateful. I want all of the Deutsche Grammophon recordings of Fischer Dieskau doing Schubert. I want his Winterreise. It was almost like a carnal hunger, acquisitiveness, sinfulness. But so I bought it, and then 3 days later he dies. This happens again and again and again. Or you think about someone and overcome by sadness for some reason, someone used to know, which happened to me once, only to discover she had died at about the time she came into my mind. I think when we aren't dogmatic materialists and we step back, it's like, a friend of mine is the very eccentric, but very acute scientific provocateur, Rupert Sheldrake. And he writes books like, Dogs Who Know When Their Masters Are Coming Home, And we've all had this. Anyone who owns dogs knows that they know things that they shouldn't know before you get there. It's not, you're on a schedule. It's not, but we push them out of our mind. And synchronicity is a good example. It's something that happens all the time. I have another friend of mine, a novelist, Sally Vickers. We used to talk about, who we were writing. We'd suddenly write to one another about a certain author, only to find that the other one had that very same moment suddenly picked up that author. And so I think there is, if we can free ourselves from our materialist dogmas, and if we're not just concerned with the metaphysical or the logical, grammar of this, and just our experience is that we participate in one another and in some shared level of consciousness all the time, and it's generally quite inconspicuous, but at times it's not, and it should tell us something, because again, that I don't believe that's an effect of quantum entanglement. It's not because I have had physical and personal contact with someone, shaking a hand or kissing someone, and therefore we're entangled. I don't believe that you can reduce it. That becomes absurd. Not that I'm dismissing that either, but I'd say that that's part of a more ideal structure. And when we pay attention to that, I think we realize that consciousness is always, it defies reduction to material causes, not just because of the logic of what mind does, but because there are experiences that exceed the narrative, the mechanical narrative, and we don't pay attention to them. We've been taught not to, since the 17th century especially. We've been taught not to notice them, or to notice them and then somehow the penny never drops,
There was,
yeah, go on.
Heather and I, we spoke before, didn't we? Because I had Heather's book, and then a few days before, I'd done a meditation, and the theme in the meditation, I won't bore you by going into it, but was almost not exactly word for word, but the same content as the next bit that I read in the book, and I was like, oh my goodness, it was really quite powerful. It's that sense of meaningfulness, isn't it? Not just coincidence. I think is
there's a certain when I've had those sort of synchronicities like you're describing, Rob, it's a certain, sometimes I say static electricity, but that sounds too stark. It has a warmth to it, but it's almost like the Cupid's arrow or something, like going straight through your heart, where it strikes you in a way that snaps you into awareness, almost like Christ saying Mary, in the garden. It's your name that reverberates inside your body, and to dismiss that or to ignore it is to miss the trajectory or destiny of your own life.
I do think that's part of the I would almost call it a pathology of modernity, but nonetheless, it's an aspect of modernity, is that we might be the first, our generations for the past 400 years, and starting in the West, but then spreading to the world, is that we, more than any other people, have been taught not to notice our own experience.
Mm-hmm.
not to notice those moments of recognition when, Mary, not only are you recognized by what's addressing you, but in being recognized, you recognize the one who speaks.
Mm-hmm.
And the uncanniness of that, and these moments that don't fit into the narrative, these moments where you've had experiences that should, I don't think it's primitivism, or primitive animism, to use the dismissive terms that used to be termed, to take dreams seriously as having more than an act, or to take these experiences seriously. But we alone, in all the generations of humankind, have been taught not to see what we see. And that's that same bracketing that you get in the mechanical philosophy. Again, it began as a method, an attempt to get to pure induction, which is impossible. It's an impossible ideal. There is no such thing as pure induction in the sciences. Like in evolutionary science, you can do away with a real belief in what you think formal causality is or what final causality is, generally because you've misunderstood what those things mean. But no biologist looks at an organism and tries to understand this or that aspect of its biology without asking, what is this for? So you never get back to pure induction. But we have been taught that there is the qualitative realm of impressions and phenomenality that somehow dissembles reality, and that what reality is just a bare, almost deterministic, or not almost deterministic, calculus of physical quantities. And so it's the piety of modernity not to see what we see, not to know what we know. I think it may be actually sort of psychopathology at the root of a lot of modern violence and distress and despair, is this constant struggle between what is speaking to us and our pious habit of not listening.
Yeah, I was going to, we've probably almost covered it to some extent, but you touch on that at the end of the book in terms of the risk of nihilism, and I guess that need for what's the phrase people use, re-enchantment, the resacralization of the world, and so forth. And I think you talk about you sort of fear in a way that we're at risk of turning the world into a machine.
Well, we have, haven't we? I mean, think of what the world was 250 years ago, and you'll find that human culture had altered things. Every organism alters its environment, but it was still the same world that human beings had inhabited physically, ecologically, environmentally, that human beings had inhabited 3,000, 4,000 years before, or 5,000, going back. It was still a largely inviolate realm of natural integrities, natural unities. It wasn't flooded with microplastics. There was a mining, but there was not blowing off the tops of mountains to get to coal. There was not the technology that creates absolutely unassimilable waste. Look at what we've done to the world under the aegis of modernity. We start with a mechanistic narrative. We end with a mechanistic reality that we've created by destroying the eloquent, beautiful, terrible reality of the world that all of our ancestors had inhabited from time immemorial. So it's not just that this machine of production and consumption, in order not to create the real wealth that is life, John Ruskin's wonderful phrase, there is no wealth but life. That instead the abstract wealth of monetary fluidity. Ellen DeGeneres can buy a house in the Cotswolds and go there. I can't. And therefore, the machine of production is functioning more robustly in her case because she's keeping this abstract and this abstraction of personal wealth in flow. That's flowing freely. What isn't flowing are our rivers and our seas, as they should be. And so the machine is real, and we are integrating ourselves into it with ever greater ingenuity. The virtual age especially is one in which not only are we, it's not just like the virtual realm is a prosthesis of our nature. It's quite the opposite. We've become a prosthesis of this integrated machine, and we're being fragmented into code in a sense, with ever shorter attention spans, ever few sense of locality or community or friendship across localities, sort of universal or cosmopolitan unity. Instead, we're just so many centers of desire and acquisition or production and labor value. We are in a machine that we have fabricated, and the fuel that the machine uses to persist is the world, which is exhaustible.
I even think about the architecture. I was in Europe last summer, and how I've begun to notice over the past few years a very visceral bodily aversion that I feel to buildings with, say like 4 white walls, and that's it. Being in a box, I can only physically tolerate it for so long before I feel like I have to eject myself from that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, and this is an odd person for me to invoke here, perhaps, because, of course, he wanted to be sort of like the arch anti-Platonist, Gilles Deleuze. Although to me, you're still a monist and even a Platonist, even if you just say, well, I'm putting difference first. It's like, well, it's not a matter of first, and it's not a matter of priority. But he talks about a Baroque ontology, or maybe we could call it a Rococo ontology, but it's one in which function isn't first. It's the overflowing of form, and in a sense, the ornament is prior to the function. That the logic of what makes a building. Yes, it has a physical structure. It has a Galileo-esque mathematical set of necessary continuities that we call that engineering. But the building doesn't emerge from that. Those are just the physical limit conditions and constants that are employed in the pursuit of the building of the real thing that's expressing itself in the architect's vision, which might be, the facade of the Church of San Giambattista, or in Venice with the sort of a physical manifestation of the bonum diffusivum sui, pouring forth the riches of beauty in this infinitely communicative idiom in which it's speaking to you again and again with beauty, with the sheer necessary uselessness of that expressiveness, because that's reality. Mm-hmm. We've reduced everything to these mechanisms. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Modern, it's horrible. And North Americans, we know this better than anyone, because, ours is a post-civilization country. So we have strip malls that are the physical topography of hell somehow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Or even hospitals. Going into a hospital, it's, my daughter was there for 8, and it was, by the end of it, I felt like I was in a prison. Like there's nothing about this environment, not speaking of the people working there, but the physical environment that makes me, I wasn't even sick, and I felt like I was getting sick.
This is even, so this is recognized more and more in medical circles. The hospital in which my son was born a quarter century ago, Martha Jefferson in the UVA had this wonderful maternity hospital, because they suddenly realized, why are we making this like a prison? Instead, it's a bedroom with curtains and flowers and nice furniture. And after my wife gave birth, I slept there on the pull-out bed alongside her, and things like that. And it really was, there was something right about it.
Yes.
No one should be born into the vacuum of the modern medical architecture. This isn't to blame anyone. I mean, these are large functioning systems that are trying to keep people alive and break. But nonetheless, you realize that I realized very vividly then that there was a spiritual disease, a malady expressed in the mechanization of everything, even our architecture. I mean, civic architecture, it never even was open to question how it should express itself. You know, it wanted to be humane, not just human. Beauty was always an intrinsic value, without which, why would you hire an architect at all? Well, you just now, you know, everything is a matter of production, consumption, efficiency, compartmentalization. I mean, it is ever more a mechanistic culture. And of course, now with the rise of AI and large language models, large reasoning models, ever more, we're in a reality in which the machine runs itself, and we're just functions within the processing of the machine rationality. And it's a horrifying picture when you step back, as you just say, you suddenly step back from it and say, my God, this is insane. This isn't to romanticize the past. It's simply to say that something has gone wrong in late modernity with even how we view the world, because at some point what started as a method saying we can treat organic systems as if they were machines and try inductively then to see how they function without presupposition. Going from that to an ontology, to a cultural grammar, to a set of values. I mean, you know, where capitalism, for instance, becomes an actual moral cause for people. You know, this is the right way to create wealth. And you have to be creating wealth, and you have to be doing something productive. I noticed this. Growing the economy is a very popular phrase for talking about. And I was listening, and this was on MSNBC, you know, so they're leftish. It's what they consider left. I would consider it, you know, a little bit too far to my right. But you know, say you have a single mother, okay, who's raising 2 children and raising them to be good persons with moral wisdom, kindness, compassion, keeping them alive. In a sense, she's trying to create a society of the future, right, in doing that. She's on public assistance. According to the way we're supposed to think now, she's unproductive, because what she's doing isn't creating wealth, it isn't growing the economy. Whereas a hedge fund manager, who is a parasite on parasites in terms of what he actually does for a living. I mean, it produces, it creates nothing, it just generates more of this monetary wealth. That's considered that's considered productive. Someone who does nothing, as opposed to somebody who is creating a human reality with in a real scale of values. We look at that single mother and say, she's productive, she's creative, she's doing something real. What this guy is doing, you know, even if we allow it, we could do without it, and we would be better off if we did.
Well, and to bring it back to your book, what you're describing with the single mother, the essence of that is what I feel in Psyche, what she is offering up with the rose.
Yeah, I mean, she's obviously my heroine, my protagonist. Not that Hermes and Hephaestus don't make real contributions, but at the end, yeah, she's
love Psyche.
I was thinking, like, you know, during our conversation there, you know, would Hephaestus come back and say, well, you know, so if we've got this, you know, kind of our will is our intentionality and our will is orientated towards the good and the transcendent horizon, etc., and that's, which I agree with, by the way. Why have we got all these problems? Why is there evil in the world? So you go there, don't you, in the book? And I know you're famously opposed in a sense to theodicies and etc. But what do you do?
Well, if anyone can ever come up with a good one, I'll accept it. But you know,
well, I didn't want. I mean, Linda and I were talking last week, and you know, depends what you mean. We touched on Maya earlier on, Maya, but if everything is in mind, and this kind of touches on realism and anti-realism in a sense as well. If everything is in mind, could we conceive of this world to some extent as a kind of falling out of the fullness of true reality? So that it's a kind of dream, a bad dream, or
No. I mean, I think that you have to. I think you have. I mean, I don't object to what became of the idea of Maya and Advaita. It's just that it becomes not necessarily an Adi Shankaracharya. He's often been misread by the tradition. I think a good friend of mine, Anantanand Ramachan, has written on this, I think, very persuasively. But anyway, but nonetheless, what he means when he talks about Maya, for instance. Now, again, Maya is the same Indo-European root as magia or magic, or it's just a creative power. In Advaita, Maya is the veil of illusion, really only in the sense that those of us, when we're conscious of the reality around us, we think of it defectively as separate from God. And therefore we create a reality that's separate from God. When we mistake at twilight, mistake the rope, piece of rope lying in the road for a snake, we're dwelling within a reality where the snake's there. That's not, it's not an illusion in the sense that it's not real. It's not a hallucination. It's not a mirage in the desert. That's not what he means by but there is a fallenness of vision. There's a fallenness of consciousness. Atman does not remember itself, or the spirit that God breathed into Adam does not recall the spirit from whom it came. But there is also the concrete evil of experience, which isn't just a misconstrual. Something, and again, if you don't separate, mind and nature the way the post-Cartesian age we do, this isn't that much of a problem. But the reality we inhabit really is a defective and a broken. And I think it's most interesting in the Christian tradition. It's those theologians like Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus who insist that creation is created in its last end, that everything is really. And so that the world we inhabit isn't yet real, isn't yet fully real. It's on the way to real. The only really real thing within the phenomenal order is the risen Christ, because that's already eschatological. That's what all creation should be, or the burning bush. It's absolutely suffused with divine glory and yet unconsumed. That's what, in the Gospel of Mark, the Transfiguration is the axis of the gospel. It clearly is. It's very much a late antique theophany novel. And in a sense, almost more than the resurrection, because all we really have of the original ending of Luke, which I think might be the original ending of Luke, is the women finding the tomb empty and going away in astonishment. But you don't need to add to that because we already know who and what Christ is from the Mount of Transfiguration in Mark. So it's very clear in that gospel. And in that sense, that's reality. That experience is the ground of things. But so long as even though God is near to us, we are far from God. As long as we dwell in the land of unlikeness, or in this condition of, the mortal body or the flesh, or however you want to understand it, or the realm of Maya, or fallenness within the realm of re-becoming Punabhava, whatever tradition, that's real, but it's not reality in its final manifestation and its true ground. In the book, as you notice, Hephaestus, I hope you would all agree, is not a straw man in any way, and I do not make him a naive materialist or an incompetent disputant. He doesn't get as many lines as the others, but that's because the book is making an argument about something. So mostly he raises an objection, and then the sed contra takes up a lot of space. But I think when he goes to the problem of evil, I want to leave that open at the end, because the philosophy can only get you so far, or can get you only so far, so as not to misplace my modifier there. And where it gets you, there is still this aporia. The problem of evil, because of complacency about the problem of evil bothers me more than just about any other theological solecism. You do have to grapple with that, and there I think I don't know what I could accomplish in the realm of philosophy. I can only show that there's a dissonance here, and Hephaestus gives. You got to understand, if I think of Hephaestus as a character in my mind, back when he was a god at first, emerging from Kronos and he he may have been one of Nietzsche's rude, healthy, noble souls, a bird of prey, a lion who couldn't think of his victims. But I like to think that the Hephaestus who now lives in the Intramundium or in the Intramundia or in the Metacosmia or however, has mellowed and become a moralist and has grown old and seen the suffering of creation. And so I wanted that to be his final statement, is at the end, non credo, because there's a moral protest, there. And I left that open for reasons. I talk about those things in my theological works, but not philosophical works. I talk about them in my fiction, in a sense. I mean, I've dealt with the problem of evil more, not in a didactic way, but in short stories and fantasy novels that I've published and things, because I can find ways of grappling with it narratively, but I don't have a dialectical solution to it. And as you mentioned, I think in a sense, a lot of early Christianity is a refusal of a dialectical. There's a very powerful provisional dualism in the New Testament that I think we don't take seriously enough. It's not an ultimate ontological dualism, but it's much more serious about the darkness of this world than later, more, later theological syntheses proper, just too quick to say, well, it's, original sin, the fall, it's like, well, free will. Okay, well, these are rough sketches of an answer, but they're not the whole story.
Thanks, David. I'm wondering, is this a good point to finish? We're at an hour and 3/4.
Can I just say something, right?
Yeah.
About the problem of evil. I've just remembered watching a documentary about the Ukrainian Revolution, and I remember feeling choked up when I saw images of people getting killed. But what choked me up was the fact that they huddled together and they were helping one another against the oppressor who was in Putin's pocket, against the police. And they were dying, but still persevering and marching forward and singing the national hymn. And that really choked me, because I felt the love as I was watching the documentary, and I was in tears, and I really felt it was really profound to me. And it's amazing how something so beautiful can come out of something so horrible like war. So I don't know if there's a profound meaning to be found.
No, I think there is. In an earlier book of mine called The Experience of God, when I'm dealing with being consciousness, bliss, ananda, or wajd in Arabic, talking about moral sense and insisting that this is definitely irreducible to the neo-Darwinian story or to evolutionary psychology. And I give reasons for, including just reasons regarding intentionality. But the other thing is, my claim is, that ultimately love is a real cause. It's not an epiphenomenal illusion. In those moments, you discover something more fundamental, that love is an actual ontology of what it is to be human, but what it is to exist at all. And I say this not in just a sentimental, vague way. Love makes everything. I'm saying that in a very rigorous and precise way, when you examine the conditions of experience and what's happening there, love makes everything. But we make, and material conditions also make hells of everything. When you see these, I mean, right now, for God's sake, we're living in a moment in history where psychotic cruelty has become the normal means of conducting policy. Children when they're being starved in Gaza, being shot down at random when they go for food. There's just this pure hatred and malice expressed in this, the delights in cruelty. In this country, we're sending people to detention camps and even to a notorious, well, Psyche, which is, they call it a gulag or a torture prison. It's a death camp, actually. Now, we've got those Venezuelan, luckily now, or fortunately, they've been taken out of Psyche and sent to Venezuela. But the spectacle of cruelty also tells us something about ourselves, because what we've discovered, what we're discovering now in this country, but everywhere at this moment, you know, it was discovered in Nazi Germany, is that there's a spiritual plasticity, there's a pliancy in us that can turn towards utter cruelty with just enough, you know, especially if the algorithms are running, but even before the days of the algorithms, when people were led down the garden path to hell online, we see that too. So I want to say, what you're saying is right. I want to say that the ontology lies in the love that manifests itself in the midst of this. But then we still have to grapple with the reality and the perenniality of hate and how easily that is evoked. And whereas ontologically, I want to say that's a privation of the good, a privatio boni, a steresis tu agathu, whatever. And I believe that. Nonetheless, experience forces us not to be glib and hasty about it, and recognize that this is not something that you can just wave away with that sort of regal, Thomistic indifference to human experience with just a few banal categories. You know, well, that's all explained by the fall. You know.
Yeah, evil has almost like a sunken, fallen God quality with like a gravitational sucking pull down to the bottom.
I honestly, I mean, yes, I fully believe that evil is ultimately privation. It's not a substance unto itself, and yet it is a profoundly powerful gravitational nothingness. It's a black hole. And I don't, you know, I think that all the great religious and philosophical traditions have dealt with it as far as they can. But as yet, I don't want to pretend that once you've said, well, we need to get past physicalism and grant a divine, or however you want to describe it, prior reality, infinite mind, we're still left with being obliged then to grapple with what this means at the level of moral and spiritual experience, and why children die of cancer, you know, and you're right, Mr. Transcendent Psyche.
Birdie, as you called me.
I object to theodicy. Well, for the same, you know, I think like Ivan Karamazov, you know, his arguments are not answered by the elder Zotsimas. They aren't. People pretend they are, but they're not. That's just a radically different vision. So Ivan is never fully answered. So.
Thank you so much. Should we close up there? And I'm wondering, maybe does anyone have a last? Sorry.
Said I'll send you my bill. No.
Oh yeah.
The tab's on me. Don't worry. I'll cover the bill.
Okay.
You got it. Thanks. Yeah. Canadian dollars. Is that good?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything's going to be better than the American dollar soon.
Well, who knows? I have no idea what Trump's doing with all of the trade wars and everything. I can't even keep track of it. So.
Doing absolutely nothing except destroying economic relationships and amity. The trade deal with Japan that he announced 2 days ago turns out not to have been a deal at all. And in fact, what there was of it, if it went, it would be worse for the U.S. than for Japan. The Japanese prime minister had to come out and say, "Wait a minute." He's
here's a question.
What he?
I mean, speaking as a
nothing. Anyway, we're getting off topic. We're trying to sew this up, right?
I was going to say, what's universal mind? What's universal mind doing through Trump then? What's going on there?
He might be the prime countervailing proof that everything is mind.
He's an emblem of a fallen archangel.
He seems, as far as I can tell, to be the absolute negation of mind and spiritual goodness. So and yet there he is. So he might be the big problem for theodicy that we have to grapple with right now.
Well, ironically, I think what your book is getting at, David, would actually be, I mean, when this is too general, but I'll go ahead and just make the generalization for the picture. But when I think of like materialists and atheists, I generalize that more to people who would probably be on the left, and it's their inability to grasp what you're saying in this book that actually would bring some sort of completion to the objectives. But sort of the overall inability to grasp it leaves us sometimes in a sort of chaos in which someone like Trump can emerge as order.
Yeah, no. I mean, I don't ask you to associate it with the left, but it could be that, being pretty much a lefty myself and associating with religious people. But some of the most interesting conversations I've had on this in recent years are with Marxists who have been persuaded that the materialism of the mechanical philosophy and the historical materialism of Marxism are not the same thing at all. And the novelist China Mieville and the journalist Richard Seymour both reached out to me a few years ago about the experience of God, which they had both taken a lot from, and I think of course, I don't know. I mean, like, if you look at the four atheists, the four horsemen of the new atheist apocalypse, what were their politics? Sam Harris has turned out to be a little bit of a racialist, and his anti-Islamic bigotries, his anti-Muslim bigotries, were there from the first. Well, one of the Steven Pinker's obviously not one of those four, but he's someone who comes to mind. Basically a libertarian, So on economic and other issues, he's actually quite far to the right. Christopher Hitchens was all for the Iraq War. I mean, it's to my mind, when you're really atheist, when you're truly atheist, and you're conscious of what it is not to believe, you have very negotiable values. But people on the right who profess belief, of course, are very frightening to me because, especially in the U.S. right now, I mean, you have all these evangelicals supporting a regime that is basically satanic in its values. That basically just tortures people, Latinos especially, and that does nothing but take away health care from the poor in order to increase the wealth of the wealthy. And so, yeah, I'll admit that there's a formal avowal of faith in this country by those who are on the right, but obviously they're utter nihilists. They don't actually believe in this this universal reality of the God who joins us all to one another as living spirits. They just happen to think that the ultimate arbitrary, nasty, vicious, brutal despot who's even has a little bit more authority perhaps than Mr. Trump is God.
But there's the appeal to that sure. Carries resonance across the whole side that unifies. Yeah, where if again, generally speaking, if the left could truly grasp what you're saying about the emergence of radiance and this unifying,
well, I'd say many do, and I would remind you that the truly important movements in the left in America have always come out of the Black church tradition.
That's correct. Yeah.
So it's not, but I know what you mean. Yeah, and I think that's the after effect of the Enlightenment project, which in a sense is the fault of Christendom. It's it's a moral protest against the cruelty and hypocrisies of late Christendom and the absolutism, that because it was rejecting Christendom within the context, it was then rejecting Christianity and ultimately religion. Like, Voltaire did not care for atheism, but he couldn't be a Christian because for him, Christian meant Christendom. The sort of thing that killed people in its name, even in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Even in his lifetime, he had seen this. And so, yeah, that's part of our heritage in the West, is the negation of what was already a nihilistic hypocrisy and charlatanism within the official structures of Christianity and religion. And
Yeah,
it
and that's
persists.
persists today.
You have someone with a very crude philosophical mind like Richard Dawkins, it's just going to become, or Jerry Coyne, it's going to become, good and evil. But just, so I understand what you're saying, but I just kind with it. There are quite a lot of very religious and idealist.
Yeah. There's nuance. I'm too general, but I do think that what you're saying in your book, if it was widely embraced, would make a big difference.
I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
The four horsemen of new atheism used to be my heroes, and now it's all gone.
I liked Christopher Hitchens as a person, even though he was dreadfully wrong on so many things, because he was utterly earnest and sincere. I was actually supposed to debate him in public, and I think it was Cornell, but it might have been Stanford. And the people who were setting it up were going to get George Stephanopoulos to referee it, and his father's a Greek priest, so he's not a laicist. Then, of course, that's when they discovered the throat cancer, and so it never came off. I actually kind of liked him, but the others I could do without. I mean, Daniel Dennett was not just a bad philosopher. There are other things about him that, let's just say, I wouldn't have wanted to be a close friend. And Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. But I will say a good word for Christopher Hitchens. He meant well, even when he got it dreadfully wrong.
Isn't that all of us?
No. Right now, the world is being governed by people who intend ill, who intend evil,
That's fair.
who are trying to enrich themselves and hurt other people in order to distract from what they're doing.
Yeah, I didn't mean to deny that. I just meant that even when we do intend to do well, we fail. Not that people don't.
We do, but we're not dogs. We're only human beings. We do our best.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I've very greatly appreciated this opportunity, and thank you for humoring my questions, even though I hadn't read your book. It's been a lovely chat.
I've read the book and I recommend it to everyone. And the format of the book is just brilliant, because you don't get a sense of you dictating to the reader what to think. It's a dialogue. It's almost like a debate going on, mostly between three idealistic gods, let's say, and Hephaestus. But it's brilliant, the format, because it's almost like you are giving a voice to any reader who might have some reservations about what's being presented. So I think it's brilliant.
Thanks. That's kind of you. And I do. I mean, because I do take the other side seriously. I mean, I don't want to caricature it. Precisely because of the problem of evil, by the way. That's why it comes up at the end.
Yeah.
And
So
we need the other side to refine, a further
Yeah. I would totally echo what Alinde said. Having got the Audible version, or the Kindle version, because I was trying to use it to make notes, and the paper version, David. So you've got triple royalties from me, so in Great British pounds, of course. But yeah.
Hey, as I said, the dollar is weakening by the day, so all the sterling I can get.
Okay, thanks to everybody for joining us, and thank you to viewers for listening to us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.